really supposed to operate according to the laws of the world. You're supposed to offer something different, and that's I think still the challenge. So, anyway, your own thoughts. I'd be curious to know. Yeah.
I just have another question. I know during the Vancouver opening ceremony, like a ton of it was devoted to appreciating the First Nations people. I mean, now that I am hearing this, I'm kind of thinking about that. I mean, what are your...
Well, I mean, Canada has had a very bad exposure in the press. I don't know how much of it was reported down here, but when the apology happened in June of 2008, in the year before that, there was a Native member of Parliament, Gary Morasti, who had seen our film, and he got up in Parliament and he asked, when are these children who died, when are they going to get a proper burial? When are you going to repatriate the remains, right? And the shit hit the fan then. I mean, the media started reporting this stuff. For the first time, they began quoting the high death rate in the residential schools and all that. And so, you know, around the world we began to hear, like next month I'm going to Rome, and we're presenting all of this evidence before a parliamentary committee there, and they're considering getting the European Parliament to censor Canada for its crimes of genocide, right? And to actually hold an inquiry on that. Canada knew that they're facing all of this stuff, so it was an enormous public relations thing to try to make it look like, yeah, we're honoring Native people in a totally tokenistic way, because culture in that scenario is your language and your dancing. You know, it's like St. Patrick's Day parade. You know, that's the Irish who walk around and get drunk. You know, but, I mean, so it was that, and it was also simply there's this enormous guilt complex in Canada about Native people. Like I start talking about this to non-Native audiences, and the denial and the anger and the fear, like boom, are just incredible. Like I get a better reception down here in the States for this stuff than in Canada, which is kind of interesting. You know, I've often find there's, in one sense, a little bit more honesty in American culture about this. I mean, you know, you talk about, to some degree, well, I'm curious what you think about this, but, you know, you can't talk about massacres in Canada. That's what the Americans did to their Indians. And we all know about that, you know, Wounded Knee and all that. But no, up here, you know, the myth that the American, or the Native people here fled to north to be under the protection of the Great White Mother, Queen Victoria. It's all bullshit, because the same stuff happened up there.
So you get a little of that with regard to New England. We talked about that earlier. It's like, they're not here, but you know that's different now, right? But so, after reading the first book, you know, for generations, people, not just around here, but even when I grew up, what exposure we got to Native peoples left out in New England because they were all gone. It was like the beaver. I mean, the beaver were exterminated in New England by about 1820. They've come back, but they were gone. They, you know, just were killed. And so the notion was, and it's really a shame, but you know, they were all gone. You know, the Pequots were massacred, and that's why Herman Melville named both the Pequot and stuff like that. As you get further west, and you know, south of Buffalo is really not on most people's radar as west, but if you get further west, and it's far enough west. I grew up near a couple Indian reservations, so you got a little more of it, and I think you are right there. I mean, especially in the last 20 years, there is a, you know, at least people reveal the fact there were massacres, and part of that is the American Indian movement was really active beginning in the late 1960s, and you know, there were several books that came out, a couple movies, and you know, even the Feds owned up, and as you may or may not know, in the United States, Indian children were taken from their parents and sent to schools until Richard Nixon stopped it in 1976. You know, people, depending on who you are, some people have a really hard time finding positive things to say about Nixon, but he stopped that. I mean, you know, he was alerted to it and he just stopped it by executive orders. It's insane.
It's interesting. He was a Quaker too.
Yeah, he's Quaker.
Quaker.
You know, he's
still
in his own way. But I think there, on some level, there is more openness, because just as you put it, the Americans did that, right? And it's really hard to escape it. I mean, there's, you know, there's Custer in American folklore, but there's also the Little Bighorn, where they won, the Indians won for a while. And then there's, you know, as I said, there was, I think, more activity during the Civil Rights Movement, which begins in the 60s here, which quickly expanded to women Indians. And, you know, kind of coming together in that regard. I mean, Martin Luther King talked about more than just African Americans, he also brought Indians into his discussion as well. So they were forced to be more innocent about it. So people, if you take the history of the Western United States anywhere now, even when I teach it, you come out, you know about the Sand Creek Massacre, and you know about several other massacres, and you know about the Dawes Act, which you read about a little bit in Trachtenberg. I mean, that's pages 24 to 32 or something, and it's tight, compressed, but there's a lot in there. So you're right, I think there is more facing of it here, but I think there was more direct pressure as well, and then there was a bigger movement underneath it, which was fueled by the civil rights movement in this country and the Vietnam War. So that was, you know, it was a coming together of several forces, of which Indian-white relations were a part, but it was an obvious sort of coming together, if you will. So, yeah, I think that's true. I think there's more honesty about it in this country.
And I think the reason there is because the reason that there are bigger social movements for justice here than you get in Canada. Like in Canada, I had an example of it once. I saw the same thing happen, one in Toronto, one in New York. Somebody was stopped by a cop for jaywalking, and in New York, this big crowd formed, and they were yelling at the cop, and they were arguing about, you know, hey, he's in the right, leave the guy alone, and everything, right? Canada, the cop was standing, and everybody kind of gave 10-foot berth. Oh, he broke the law, don't get near him. He's suddenly a pariah because he broke the law. And you're raised, and here's the big difference. In Canada, you're raised, and it's drummed into your head from kindergarten up. You're a subject of the crown, and that's the term they use. You're not a citizen. You're a subject of the crown. Well, I'm not subject to anything, you know, except what I choose to be. And yet, in America, you're a citizen of a republic. I mean, you get that. You're a citizen of a republic. It's a very different notion. And as a subject of something, you're not allowed to challenge it. Okay, the churches and the government killed Indians, but who are we to challenge that? I mean, I get that so much. And it's a very different culture politically. You know, there aren't allowed, big movements can't arise on that basis, but they can arise in the States where people say, we have the right to dissent. Thomas Jefferson said, you need a revolution every 20 years. I mean, you have a moral duty as an American to dissent and challenge your government. Even overthrow it if you want to. I mean, that's your constitutional right. You say that in Canada and they think you're a nut and they'll lock you away. You know, you're an anarchist, you're a terrorist. You can't say that in Canada.
Yeah, just popping about dissent. I live out in Western Mass, which is more liberal than most of the United States, but not that crazy. And one of the most popular bumper stickers is "Dissent is patriotic." So don't get it.
That's an act of treason in Canada. To put that up would be an act of treason in Canada to do that.
Well, it's superficial, but it's actually serviceable in this case. This week they're reading the Virginian, one of the great Westerns, right? And many years ago I read a book by a slick but interesting Canadian, I think the journalist, Pierre Burton, a little book called Why We Act Like Canadians. And he pointed out that you think of the two countries that are